Let me know when you want me to start.
Well, I think I've got my mic on, so I better not. Don't you think?
This one working?
And this one?
Yeah, it is.
So if it's past, we'll start. Yeah.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
It's working.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first lecture. It's lovely to have you here in our building that's now open, and we're going to hear some more about the building. This is the first in our lecture series, which celebrates residents and people who worked here celebrating culture and science in Marylebone. We also have a few other things coming up. We have our cinema series, which there's a leaflet at the back which has all the information about that. And these lectures will be the first Wednesday of every month. Tonight, we're very happy to welcome Gill Hedley, who's a local resident and art historian, who's come to speak to us about Thomas Hardwick, of which many of you will be familiar with already, but we're going to hear in much more detail. Jill's also going to tell you about a book that's over here that she wrote, which is sort of the connection here. It is a free lecture, as you know. There's a bar at the back. We also welcome donations over here. And there is cheese to help yourself to afterwards. So please enjoy, sit comfortably, and if you need it, the toilets are out the door and on the left. So please welcome Jill.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction and for the invitation to speak. While I was putting the last twiddles on the talk a few days ago, I was looking online and thought, oh, good, somebody has written about Thomas Hardwick, something I can plunder. And then I realised it was my talk being advertised. So I'd like to congratulate Ella McBrien for all her excellent marketing and how kind she's been to me through this whole process. I don't want to spend much time answering perhaps the unasked question, why on earth I'm giving the talk, and I'm slightly worried to hear that so many people in the audience know a lot about Thomas Hardwick. Any volunteers to come up and give the talk, really, because I have to say that I am not an expert on Thomas Hardwick. But what I have done is, a few years ago, written a book about the boom in church building immediately after Waterloo, so in the years during which this church was being built. But while Hardwick was supervising the building of this church, a lot of other people were arguing in law courts and in Parliament about where money might come to cope with the movement of people from rural to urban and what became suburban communities. And the government was shamed into finding some money, and then they had to find an awful lot more because they built expensive churches, like John Soane's near neighbouring church to us here. But an independent body, the Independent Incorporated Church Building Trust, which then Building Society, which then became the National Churches Trust, were the people who shamed the government into finding the money, but didn't believe they'd do it properly. It seemed a very modern tale to me. And they too raised a lot of money and didn't give up funding church building, church repair, and the title of the book, providing as best they could free seats for all. And this church, St Marylebone, is mentioned en passant in the book because it was an example, I think, of what sort of church could and should be built. So that is my sort of claim to fame with Hardwick, and I have just written a book about an architect of a previous generation. But the National Churches Trust survives to this day, helping churches, and the book is for sale to support them. So it's £15, and there we are. That's the advert, which I feel most embarrassed having to give. So this is how I came to meet Thomas Hardwick, who, as everybody here knows, was the architect of St Marylebone Parish Church and was born in 1752, died in 1829. And here he is. This is a portrait of Hardwick by his fellow architect, but also artist, George Dance. And this is a drawing of about the time when the church was being built. What I would like to say is that George Dance always drew people looking utterly hangdog and miserable. And you'll see 3 other examples. So this is not the way Hardwick always looked. That's why I've put in the other 3, so you can sort of extract the George Dance element from order. But it is a lovely drawing, I think. And at this point, so Hardwick is about 62, and I think we have to remember that. When you think of this church as Hardwick's masterpiece, you sort of think somebody might be just perhaps a little bit earlier in eagerly building a church. No, and I will discuss to some extent why he was so old by the time he got round to building it. This is very much a lecture about Thomas Hardwick. It is not about the building of St Marylebone Church, and there is a wonderful history. I have read a lot of church histories on church websites, and they're usually dreadful. The one on the St Marylebone Church website is excellent. There's a short version, there's a long version, and I really do commend it to you. It tells you the story in much more detail than I will, because I am concentrating on our friend and hero, Thomas Hardwick. So this is Thomas Hardwick III, and he was the third in a generation of Thomas Hardwicks. So Thomas Hardwick I moved from Herefordshire, just near Ross-on-Wye, and I am conscious that his relations are sitting in the front row. Please shout out when I get it wrong. And he moved to Isleworth in West London about 1711, and he obviously had quite a bit of money, and he must have known what work he was coming for. He owned property, and he was a good man. He was a philanthropist. And while in West London, his son was born in Isleworth. And now I haven't actually learned how to do this, so I'm going to wander off and show you. The Thames, terrible slide, I'm sorry, the Thames, Kew, Sion House, Old Brentford, New Brentford. And that pattern just about exists today. And the second Thomas Hardwick, the one born in Isleworth, was a stone mason. His father was a stone cutter. A mason, obviously, a more sophisticated trade, but he became a builder, what we would call an architect, and I'll go on to some of those details in a moment. His son, in turn, was born in New Brentford, so not in Isleworth, in New Brentford, but very nearby, but he died in Berners Street in Marylebone. He became a Marylebone resident, not just a Marylebone architect. So, let's call him our Thomas, if you don't mind me calling him ours, as he's yours, thank you very much. Our Thomas Hardwick's father, the stonemason, worked for the very famous Adam brothers, and he got that work when his son was about 8, so presumably conscious of what his father was doing. And that work was on the interiors of Sion House, the country house of the Duke of Northumberland, which I showed you on that map, in Brentford. And the Adams themselves were the sons of a stonemason. And at this point, the 1760s, the early 1760s, Robert Adam and William Chambers, both Scots, were architects to the king. These were honorary posts. They were paid next to nothing, but it was obviously helped enormously in their business practice. And this was just about the time when the term architect became currency. So Thomas Hardwick II, the stonemason, the one who was born in Isleworth, as a builder, I think we should safely call him, rebuilt the nave of St Lawrence in Brentford, where the family were all later buried, not all, but that early generation were buried. probably doing the design himself, but I don't think we would have called him an architect. And this career lasted. So 20 years later, he was asked to build the Church of St Mary, Hanwell, in that same area of West London. Now, I keep harping on about the profession of architect in the 1760s, so I'll come to the point now. On the left, you see a really rather lovely portrait of William Chambers, and one version of this, not this particular version, it's by Francis Coate, was owned by Thomas Hardwick. It was painted about 1764, and it was just the point when he was beginning to, with others, plot to create the profession of architecture. An earlier Duke of Northumberland had sent a mason in his employ and a designer to Italy, and this is the first use in English of this term, that he was going to study the works of these skillful masters in architecture. So the Duke of Northumberland wanted to say that the man doing his building was an architect, but it didn't quite stick, if you like. And I've been through Dr. Johnson's dictionary, looking at all the definitions of builder, architect, surveyor, and they all simply self-refer. So a surveyor's an architect's a builder, and so on. But in 1768, things changed, and it changed because of this Swedish Scot, William Chambers. Up till that point, like Hardwick, architecture was largely practiced by very talented joiners or masons, people who were apprenticed. Scientists, Christopher Wren, for instance. Designers, like Inigo Jones, are great architects before this period, and a lot of talented amateurs who then employed masons, surveyors, joiners to put their ideas, mostly learnt on the grand tour, put them into practice on their family estates when they came home. But Chambers took it a stage further. He'd been architectural tutor to the king when he, as a boy, obviously, and he persuaded King George to support financially and by title the Royal Academy of Arts, and Chambers became its first treasurer, not, however, a teacher in architecture. He did publish the first illustrated work to be the seminal English language treatise on architecture. Before that, it had been English translations of largely Italian treatises, Palladian in particular. And as I was saying to Hardwick's descendants earlier, the best thing that happened to Thomas Hardwick Jr. was being born in 1752. How clever. Because if the profession of architecture is being rationalised, promoted and made financially significant, then be 16 at the time it's happening. And he was. And at the age of 17, Hardwick's father paid Chambers £200, quite a lot of money. He was not poor, as I've been trying to emphasise the mason Hardwick, to teach his son. And Chambers and Adam, as I said, were the architects of the king, both Scots. They knew each other, rivals of course, but they knew each other. And so Hardwick worked with the Adam brothers, will have been introduced to Chambers and said, I've got a bright boy who wants to be an architect. Oh, and I've got some money to help him on his way. And so young Thomas Hardwick worked in Chambers' office, helped him with his designs for Kew, the pagoda, the temple, the Baalbek temple and so on, and also the great palace of Somerset House, which is Chambers' masterpiece, one of London's masterpieces, and it later became the home of the Royal Academy. They were all squashed into rooms in, in Pall Mall when young Hardwick became a student. And he became a student along with painters, sculptors and engravers, but he was one of the very, very first people to enter the school, which was designed, as it says on the screen, to establish a school or academy of design for the use of students in the arts. So, in other words, the students copied and copied and copied from the antique. Didn't matter what their discipline was, they all copied. And Hardwick won a silver medal in his first year, which means he won the first ever silver medal of the Royal Academy. And he continued his link with the Royal Academy, which obviously, as we all know, still has the same function today in having an annual exhibition where architects' drawings or sculptors' models or finished casts are exhibited. Started in the late 1760s, and Hardwick annually exhibited his drawings, by which I mean he proposed them, they were accepted. It wasn't automatic. But he repeatedly failed to be elected to be an associate and therefore could not be a full Royal Academician. But he did have distinguished public posts throughout his life. Why he wasn't elected, nobody seems to have a very good answer, and I wonder whether it is not the shadow of William Chambers perhaps falling coldly over him. He would have been elected by obviously existing Royal Academicians, and I don't know enough. I don't think anybody has looked at what the emotional links were, let's say, how irritated people were by Chambers, and he will have been seen as Chambers' man. He was Chambers' man. He was a very lucky young man, I think, and that his father could pay for him. I love the way it's written in many places that he was able to fund himself. Well, I think it would be his dad. Paid for him like all manner of the aristocracy and the upper middle class, was enabled to go on a grand tour. He followed the pattern of William Chambers, who went not just to Italy, but also went to France. So Hardwick went to Lyon and Paris, but ended up in Italy and met up with a fellow student, a painting student from the Royal Academy, a Welsh student who kept a very detailed diary, and painted some of the most beautiful oil studies that this country's ever produced, I believe. He's a wonderful artist. Lucky Hardwick having him as a friend. And this is Jones's study of excavations at the deliciously named Villa Negroni, I just like saying it, which is in Rome. And you can see the excavations going on and a gentleman surveying it, surveying the scene, not as a surveyor, and a group of young men, do you see? So let's pretend. There's Hardwick, and there is Jones. Why not? One of them may well have been John Soane, who was a fellow architecture student at the Royal Academy, 1 year after Thomas Jones, and poor, and a genius. They didn't get on. They worked together on various drawings while they were there, but that relationship, I'm afraid, really didn't last. And I can imagine there might have been quite a bit of tension. And John Soane went on to be a notable character. I think this is that he's for another lecture, but a genius, in my view. And here are Hardwick's beautiful measured drawings, so absolutely architecturally precise, of the interior of the Villa Negroni in Rome. And part of the crew was also one of those extraordinary agents that seemed to pop up all the time whenever a young milord was in Rome saying, "Psst, I could buy you that." And so these, the paintings, the wall drawings, were bought, but unfortunately, although they were brought back to England, and they were bought by the Bishop of Derry, but they do not survive, but the drawings do. So he went off in 1776, and he came back in 1779, 3 gap years, and returned to London, living in Soho, and began to design churches. This was his earliest church, St Mary Wanstead in Essex, very near the great house in Wanstead, the greatest building of modern British architecture in the early 18th century, Wanstead House. And then also a chapel of ease, St James's Chapel in Hampstead, sadly demolished, and a sister church to this church, St John's Wood. So forgive the slide. So this was the chapel in Hampstead Road. So that's just at the top of Tottenham Court Road, just beyond the junction with the Marylebone Road. And you're beginning to see a bit of something look a little familiar if we go back. Look at the, yeah, so all white and here brick. But I think you can see some familiar patterns of both portico and tower. And here, the St John's Wood, built as a chapel, now a church, and built as the original plans were for this church, as a chapel of ease, a sort of overspill, if you like, for a hugely burgeoning population, built with modesty, and then, in this case, converted to a parish church, and partly echoed in the history of St Marylebone, which we'll come on to in a moment. In fact, we'll come on to it immediately. So Sir John Summerson, the great architectural historian, has a wonderful phrase about the nabobs arriving in Marylebone with all their money. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And Marylebone was London's most populous parish at the end of the 18th century. On the left we see, and I'm sure you know this very well, this wonderful painting by Hogarth, one of the stages of the Rake's Progress, when Tom Rakewell marries his, let's just call her a wealthy bride, shall we? We don't need to describe her in any other way. And the marriage takes place in 1732 inside the not the original, one of the Marylebone chapels. Now, I mentioned the wonderful website that this church hosts. Read that for all the stories, all the iterations of this church. But the Hogarth interior is the interior of this church, which somebody might have seen here in 1749. So that's the top of the High Street. And you'll know exactly where I mean if you focus on the little obelisk. That's in the Garden of Rest now. But by 1818, when this church opened, there were 756,624 souls in Marylebone, but only 8,700 of them could get a seat on a Sunday. And that is really the message of the book that I was referring to. The men behind the Incorporated Church Building Society were incensed that this completely changing population, which nobody had quite noticed, because they were fighting the French. I mean, this is crude, but simply that was where the government's attention was focused. But Marylebone, Manchester, Birmingham, all of the big cities were changing so rapidly. And in London, Bristol, other cities getting smarter as well as poorer. As I said, nothing much changes. So wealthy people were moving in, but they were serviced by, as ever, people who were living in desperate conditions and did not have a church to go to. And there were plenty of people, Methodists in particular, it was believed, who would scoop up that needy group of people and take them away from the Church of England. Bit of a dramatic way of putting it, but as I said, I go on at great length elsewhere. So that was the situation in Marylebone when a change in population and also a local landlord who thought, actually, what I want for my new estate is something just a little bit smarter than a chapel of ease. But to just return both to Methodists and that obelisk, Marylebone was the home of Charles Wesley. from the late 1770s, and he had officiated at the marriage of Thomas Hardwick's parents in St Anne's, Soho in 1748. And so, just before he got married to Sarah Witham, and I mean this is Thomas Hardwick's father married Sarah Witham, his mother, Hardwick went on a preaching tour with John Wesley. Now that either means he was a devout Methodist or he wanted to marry Sarah Witham. I don't know. But it seems it seems a bit odd to me, but I don't really know the level of Methodist belief in the family, except that Sarah and Sarah's family, the Withams, were very devout. Now, back to William Chambers, who never really is far away in this story. As early as 1770, William Chambers, one of the most fashionable and distinguished architects of his day, and living in Marylebone at the time, was commissioned by the vestry here to come up with some designs. And so he came up with 5 proposals. And here is one pair, one inside and one outside. So Hardwick was still his pupil when this was going on, 1770, so he's only 18. Church doesn't open till 1818. So there is a long, tortuous and very unpleasant history of relations between Chambers and the vestry. He kept coming up with designs and they kept coming up with no decision and certainly with no money. He designed the layout of the, the graveyard, North Paddington Street Gardens, also a design proposal. But nothing happened. 7 Acts of Parliament were written in an attempt to get the right church. But this is not really part of Hardwick's story. This was Chambers' problem. However, he was the obvious choice when finally it was decided that not only was there the money and the site and the will and the Act of Parliament, but an intention to build a full-scale, glamorous parish church, by which time, William Chambers had died waiting for this, but there was the loyal, thoroughly educated and practiced church architect Thomas Hardwick, ready to step in. So first of all, he was asked, like Chambers, to build a chapel, as I showed you, a twin almost, to St John's Wood, but then finally to develop his designs into a full-scale and splendid parish church. Now, when I walked here from home, which is a very, very short walk, I went up the mews and walked around the back, because this view, although not the one mostly illustrated, this rear elevation, is, I think, quite magnificent. It's what makes this a great church. And this was originally planned as the main entrance from the High Street and has a Baroque, Roman Baroque splendour to it, which was actually really very unfashionable by that time, but I think quite spectacular. And here was his interior, the painting by Benjamin West, president of the Royal Academy, the American president, that you can see. And what had been called earlier in the 18th century, dismissed in earlier versions of this style as a prayer box. It was designed so that the sermon dominated. And an elegant, clever, light-filled interior, but too plain and actually genuinely thought of as not sufficiently religious by a Victorian generation who produced, well, we know what they produced, but at least we know what Hardwick wanted. A great pity, I think, but still. And here the church as we know it, which of course then became the focal point of John Nash's display of Regency splendour in the terraces that surround Regent's Park, so that the church became an eye-catcher, an entrance and an exit at York Gate for the Prince Regent's great piece of town planning. So this is Thomas Hardwick, just that in about 1800, and he was a founder member of the Architects Club, which really was a forerunner. It was a forerunner of the RIBA, if you like. It was something that the architects dreamt up for themselves to regulate themselves, whereas the Royal Academy was seen very much as a teaching institution. The Architects Club actually was really on a fairly small scale. It was a drinking club and a dining club, but really, if you were anybody, you were a member. And he was a founder, but never was he able to have the initials RA after his name. And as I said earlier, I'm not really sure why. He wrote a biography of his master, William Chambers, not published, except in I think it's 15 copies exist. He clearly wished to be associated with William Chambers, who was knighted and became, I think this is the best title that anybody's ever been. He is a Knight of the Polar Star. It's a great title. And one of the things Hardwick is always praised for, which I find rather strange, is that he was the head of a dynasty of architects. I think that just sort of happened somehow. And of course he's in the middle of a dynasty. 2 Thomases before him, who were builders, and 2 Philips after him, his son Philip Hardwick and Philip Hardwick's own son, Philip Charles Hardwick. So from 1711, when the first Thomas Hardwick moved to Isleworth, to the death of Philip Charles in 1892, the name Hardwick really was heard regularly, associated with major buildings throughout Britain, largely in London, but not entirely. And indeed, Hardwick himself, I'm sure you recognise the church building style now. This is his rather lovely St John's Workington of 1823, and much, much, much earlier, the Shire Hall in Dorchester. And also in London, his Gothic-spired St Clement's in Old Street, but this has been drastically rebuilt. It was badly bombed. Now, I've put this in just for no good reason, or perhaps for a friend in the back row. This is a church that we visited with my mother in Cumbria, near Netherby, a few years ago. And John Harris, the architectural historian, just floated out the idea that this could be an early Thomas Hardwick. I can see no reason for it, no likelihood, but you can see, looking at the tower, what Harris might have had in mind, built in beautiful local red sandstone. It's a delightful church, and I've put it in as a red sandstone herring, I think. I don't think it is Hardwick, but it would be very nice if it was. And who is it by? We don't know. He was also an important restorer of churches. And I don't know whether you know this octagonal interior of St Bartholomew the Less, but it was built by George Dance, he of the gloomy portraits. And so very soon afterwards, Hardwick had to restore it. So Dance obviously didn't do a brilliant job, but this was a very important part of his practice. And most significantly of all, he restored Christopher Wren's great St James Piccadilly, and twice Inigo Jones's St Paul's in Covent Garden. Twice you can see why. First of all, he did it in 1788, and then look what happened. So he then restored his own building after this tragic fire. But those are the 2 most significant churches, if you put St Paul's to one side two significant churches in the centre of London, and Hardwick knew them, took them apart, put them together again, knew them intimately. Those two antecedents and everything that he learnt in Rome, and particularly his knowledge of the Pantheon, and here's one of his drawings, I believe informed, well, I don't think I believe, I'm sure it is absolutely certain, informed his design of St Marylebone. Now there's another gloomy portrait, you see what I mean? That sort of hangdog look of Charles Rossi. And it's Rossi who modelled the glorious caryatids on the tower, between the tower and the dome of St Marylebone. And he went on, Rossi, to model the much butcher, powerful caryatids on the splendid St Pancras Church, just along the Marylebone Road, the most expensive church built in Britain after St Paul's, I might add. And here, not a very good photograph, but, you know, how on earth can you get a good photograph of these glorious caryatids? And I wondered where they came from, because they're Hardwick's design. It's not Rossi. Rossi does the modelling, he doesn't do the design. And they struck me as being far more French than Italian, but I haven't been able to do enough looking into this. But I did find this rather lovely engraving after one of Raphael's design for a caryatid in the Vatican. And this caryatid is not only holding up a building, but she is holding victory in her hand, the figure of victory. There's a lightness and delicacy about it that just made me wonder whether this was something that Hardwick had looked at. I love the way the hand is there saying, it's not really, I can manage this, I'm fine. It's not that sense that the whole building is weighing them down. They are light angels, they're not solid pillars of women. I think they are one of the most splendid aspects of this building. Now, park this in your mind if you would. Rossi lived locally, lived in Marylebone, and with the very eccentric artist Benjamin Haydon, they lived just off Lisson Grove. So, just park that, please. Thomas Hardwick went on to work, like his father before him, for the Duke of Northumberland as a surveyor and an overseer. He worked at Sion, and he worked on Northumberland House, which is the Duke's London house. Now, one of the things, it's a very long and complicated story, which I urge you to find elsewhere. There's an academic article about this gateway, which is a copy of the Adam Gateway from Zion, which Hardwick was employed to produce and send to Brazil. And this is still the gateway to the zoo in Rio de Janeiro. It's a very complicated story, all about princes expecting it to be a gift, and the British Crown having to pay to have this constructed in Rio. Now, back to Lisson Grove. This is Hardwick's Christ Church now, as I'm sure you know, no longer a functioning church, and one that Philip Hardwick, his son, completed in the 1820s. And Philip himself continued this extraordinary run of classical buildings along the Marylebone and the Euston Road. His design on the top and the sadly demolished Euston Arch, which, as I'm sure many of you know, was fought so passionately by John Betjeman to be retained. Built in 1837, his design and a photograph of it, extraordinary enough. And at the other end, so you got on it, you walked through the arch, got on the train, and you got out at Philip Hardwick's Curzon Street station in Birmingham of 1838, and very elegant it is too. So as well as educating, training his son Philip, not his only son, the other sons didn't study architecture. Thomas Hardwick took on pupils and assistants, rather as he had been taken on by Chambers, both to be taught but to work for him. I mean, it was a proper apprenticeship. Turner, who I know is going to be subject of a later talk, was employed to complete architectural drawings for Hardwick. So it wasn't to teach him to be an architect, it was to help him to learn how to draw buildings, but also to help Hardwick do the colouring in, the twiddly bits, like the little bits of trees that architects put on their models. So he worked for him as a young man, and these very young, these are two early Turners, which stayed for a while in the Hardwick family, drawn when Turner was about 15. St Mary Wanstead before he started on it, and the other one is Isleworth. And there's Turner by George Downes, and Turner certainly wasn't as quiet as that. They had met, by which I mean Hardwick and Turner, when the young Turner was living in Brentford. He was sent from Maiden Lane to stay with an uncle in Brentford, and he became a family friend, not just an employee. And famously, the story goes that Thomas Hardwick said, "Don't be an architect, concentrate on being a painter." He never had any intention of being an architect, I don't think. But even so, Thomas Hardwick clearly saw that he was talented and that Hardwick, couldn't teach him any more about being a draftsman or a painter. But young Philip clearly was a friend, as well as Thomas Hardwick being a mentor, and Turner appointed Philip Hardwick as one of his executors. And our Thomas Hardwick and Turner were neighbours in Berners Street, one of the other Hardwick addresses in Marylebone, so at the turn of the 18th to 19th century. And here's a very beautiful drawing of the Pantheon. This is not the Pantheon in Rome, this is the Pantheon Oxford Street, known to us as Marks and Spencer's, which is one of several drawings which Hardwick commissioned and kept from Turner, commissioned because they were gorgeous drawings, I mean not for work purposes, commissioned because he was realised the talent of this young man. And there was a large collection that went down to the son and grandson. So, going back to addresses, William Chambers built Berners Street, or a chunk of it, the chunk that is now the Sanderson Hotel. And so Hardwick, when he was studying with Chambers, lived with Chambers. And then Hardwick acquired his own house in Berners Street, where he died, number 55, and he was there from 1807. But before that, he lived in Bolsover Street, and that was the street in which Chambers died. So there was a real closeness between the older and the younger architect. This rather odd photograph is a very old photograph of Berners Street before Sanderson's, the fabric and wallpaper shop, put up their great big building in the 50s. Superimposed, not by me, is the doorway of Chambers' house. So this was Chambers' house, that was his doorway, and a few years ago you could have bought it from Lascaux's, the London Architectural and Salvage Company. So there's the door casing. So we have Chambers and we have Hardwick firmly based in Marylebone, not just building here, but living here. Now, I am going to leave time for questions, but I want to go off at a tangent because I discovered something. It may well be known to some of you. I'm sure it won't be known to all of you, but even those who know it, I think would agree with me that this is a very nice tale, and it's sort of connected with Hardwick Honest and Marylebone. The Berners Street hoax took place in 1809, and it was perpetrated by a man called John Hook. And he lived next door to Hardwick. So Hardwick's at 55, Hook is at 54. And he bets a friend of his, who happens to be an architect as well, and rather delightfully builds theatres, the Lyric, for instance, and he also writes the plays to go on in them. I think think that's a splendidly organised career. And he bet him a guinea that he could make an ordinary address, his address, number 54 Berners Street, notorious. So, 12 sweeps, whole lot of coal lorries, lots of wedding cakes, doctors, lawyers, vicars. A priest told somebody was dying, so they came to minister to them. Fishmongers, shoemakers. Over a dozen pianos were delivered. And amazingly, the Duke of York turned up, the Archbishop of Canterbury turned up, and the Lord Mayor. And of course the crowds to watch it all. And so he won his bet, only a guinea, not a lot. But today I thought, I mean, it's such a 12 days of Christmas sort of thing. And I wonder how old that is. Now, I don't know how old the 12 days of Christmas is, but I do know it was only published in the 1780s. So it's a sort of possibly a recent idea. But I can just see poor Thomas Hardwick sitting there trying to do his designs for St Marylebone Church and looking out the window and, what is the Archbishop of Canterbury doing there? Why are all those wedding cakes appearing? Anyway, the Berners Street hoax, I think it needs a film script. So if there's anybody here, because I would love to see it on a stage. Now, Benjamin Robert Hayden lived with Charles Rossi, 116 Lisson Grove. I showed the blue plaque earlier on. And he painted Punch or May Day. Now, of course, it doesn't illustrate the Berners Street hoax, but it looks as if it does. And that's good enough for me. And you will see a very familiar sight, I hope, in the background. He painted May Day, 1829, just along from St Marylebone Parish Church. And he painted it in the year that Thomas Hardwick died. James Wyatt, who was a Gothicizing architect, called Thomas Hardwick a regular bred classical architect. I don't think it was a compliment. Classical architecture, classical versus Gothic, that's another whole chunk of the book, Free Seats for All, because architecture became highly political. Gothic versus classical, Britain versus Europe. Regular bred, I think, was meant to be dismissive, but Thomas Hardwick had architecture bred in the bone, and he was classically trained to the nth degree, both from a definingly informed architect as his tutor and master and friend, but also in his own personal study, 3 years in Italy. And he wasn't there to buy paintings and travel around meeting other aristocrats. He was there to study, and study he did, and his sketchbooks and his measured drawings, so many of them luckily survive. And this beautiful drawing of a ceiling boss from Rome as a really very young man, so in his early 20s. As a draftsman, he's not, I think, quite well enough recognised. Now, I've learnt, writing about architectural history, that what architectural historians really like is not buildings. It's architects' drawings. Charles Samara Smith pointed this out, and he's absolutely right, because they can be studied in an uncompromised fashion, whereas every building, almost every building, and this church is a perfect example of it, is no longer pure. It's got a splendid but high Victorian addition. What the historians like to study are the drawings, and Thomas Hardwick's drawings require more study. He has been written about by two excellent historians, but only very, very small aspects of his work. He was also the subject of a thesis, which I confess I have not read, by Giles Waterfield in the 60s. More needs to be found out about him, I think, but I would like to echo the National Churches Trust words on their website that St Marylebone is the UK's grandest Regency parish church. And, well, we know who built it, Thomas Hardwick. Thank you very much. So I was told that I had to say I would answer questions. So anyway, if there is anything I can explain or anything else, please. And I don't know whether that's recorded and somebody's getting a microphone. I don't know how this is going to work.
In the absence of others, I will comment, because I think this is nice.
It is indeed.
So, does anybody have any questions?
I just wondered if you knew anything about the later Victorian editions, the Apse End and all of that.
I know a lot is known, and I know where you can find it, but I'm going to bow out of that one, I'm afraid. I think you could probably answer that beautifully.
Again, it's on the website, so
Yeah.
and look at that.
Sorry.
But again, that was very much linked with William Gladstone, who of course was a parishioner, and indeed the foundation stone for those editions were laid by Mrs. Gladstone.
Yes, indeed.
And it was all part of that whole ecclesiastical movement, whereby out of that whole sort of Oxford movement thing, where churches had to look like churches and not like theatres or the sort of the Methodist preaching box, which was referenced earlier on. But yeah, lots written about that. Any other questions?
Can I ask where most of his drawings are? You say the Metropolitan Museum, that's presumably in New York?
The Metropolitan in New York, indeed. The Royal Institute of British Architects had the RIBA, meaning the RIBA at the V&A.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there are some in the British Museum, there are some in the V&A, but if you wanted to see a lot, the RIBA would be the right place to go. Yeah.
Anybody else with anything to say? Yes, please.
Can I ask you, you're not an architect, so I don't know the background, tell me the story, otherwise we'll find out.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Strikes on big buildings were going up, the Industrial Revolution was just getting going. Did they know or do anything in your work about acoustic in the big churches?
Yeah, yes they did. Yes. The solution...
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, of course, that's a very good point. I mean, we're talking about big buildings going up during the Industrial Revolution. I don't think there were big buildings that weren't factories. The churches weren't very big. But if that's what you mean, the post-Industrial Revolution churches, and did they think about acoustics? They did, and so did Christopher Wren before the Industrial Revolution. But after the Industrial Revolution and the preaching box churches, which is the derisory term for this very effective way of getting people in, there were three-tiered, I've forgotten the word, you know, where you stand. Pulpits, thank you very much. Three-tiered pulpits. And so that the parish notices were on the ground floor. The preacher rose up so that his parishioners could see him and he could be heard. And the pulpits had a top which acted as a sounding board. So very simple, clever engineering, all in wood, of course, so they resound. So yes, it was thought of, but there was indeed the problem of the big empty barns. They did resound, there's no doubt about it. So that was the solution was the pulpit, three-tier pulpit.
Any other questions? Thank you so much
Great pleasure.
for coming. I hope you will come back and tell us some of the other great connections. The other person living, I think, in Berners Street, or very close by, of course, was Benjamin West.
Indeed,
So
yes.
There's and that whole area around Rathbone Place, bottom of Charlotte Street, was amongst the most extraordinary concentrated area of design and construction in the 19th century
Yes,
in
absolutely
England,
true.
I
Yes.
think. Nearly everything in this building was crafted in 2 or 3 streets, including the invention of the suspended fibrous plaster ceiling. So it was there's a whole story about not just the people, but that whole industry.
The craft.
And the Hatherley Art School
Yes,
was
of course.
founded there as well. So
Yeah.
it was this extraordinary. So we need a lecture on that, I think.
And Benjamin West, we saw the painting, but there was, as you know, a transparency, a painting on glass, which then the Victorians obviously just thought was just too odd for words, and it went to America and, completely lost. But then that was a piece of craft work, extraordinary technical
we
skill.
have 2 pieces still here, which nobody ever sees really, because they're in my study. But Benjamin West, his art, his paintings were often transferred onto transparencies. And the Great Annunciation one is the one that used to be in part of the organ above the altar end. We've got 2 of what we think are a whole series of, possibly Benjamin West, of the Muses, and very little is known about them. But the person who transcribed all of Benjamin West's paintings onto glass is the person who did those 2 transparencies in my study, and they're from 1805. So there is that whole sort of working, I think, of craftsmanship of the very, very highest order. It was very much a Marylebone story of the late 18th and throughout the 19th century. And now, of course,
yes.
I'm not sure what is made in Marylebone today.
Chocolates.
Chocolate.
A lot of chocolate. So can I ask you a question, please? Which I meant to question one of my own slides. What happened to the model? Where is it? You've had it restored.
And it's sitting at the foot of the staircase.
Wonderful.
Was that Hardwick's original model?
No, it was made in 1869. I'm not even sure. I think the plaque is. We're doing a whole new series of labels to go with all of these things. But on your way out, and there is a donation box nearby with a touch and go device on it. So please use that. You'll see the model, and also the restored sculpture by Fenwick Lawson of Annunciation, which echoes the Benjamin West window of the 1813.
So the photograph that I've got isn't the model by Thomas Hardwick, although or was there one? Can you?
No, that was not by Thomas Hardwick.
This one isn't. This is the one that you have.
1869.
It's the same one.
It is. Yeah.
All right then. Good. Thank you.
Very well.
I've never asked a question at my own talk before, so I'm very grateful for the
Thank
answer.
you very much. for
Pleasure.
coming to
Pleasure.
this. If I could offer double thanks